Nope. Okay, good. Um, Before we dive back into theism, let me just bring up the syllabus. Do you guys know what next week is? What happens next Tuesday?
The last day.
Yeah. So next Tuesday is the final exam. Okay. So next Monday we will spend our time in a final review, and in that review we're going to kind of go over, and of course at a very quick pace, but we're going to go over the major things that we've covered in class. Um, One of the things that I wanted to give you as an encouragement as you're preparing for the final is that there will be three resources that you're allowed to have open and available by your keyboard as you're taking the final exam. Um, One of them is a Bible. The second is your notebook from this class. So the personal notes that you have taken from class. And the third are your essays and research paper. So your the stuff that you have written for assignments in the class, your notebook from the class, and your Bible are the three things that you will be able to have with you. So um, the more familiar you are with those three things, the more easily you'll be able to use them as a resource. That's just kind of my uh, preparation for the final uh, 1 week notice. Next week, we're going to do a final review. Next Monday, we're going to look at Geisler's chapter on objectivism and history. And I'm sorry, tomorrow we're going to look at Geisler's objectivism and history. Next Monday's the review. Next Tuesday is the final. And so back to today's topic, we're going to finish our study of theism and arguments that are placed against it and look at our conclusion on theism. So let me get back to that window. Okay, so come on. There we go. Okay. So the contingency, necessity, and act potency model are not arbitrary. Okay. Um, so when we say the contingency, necessity, and act potency model, what we're talking about are the relationship between me as a contingent being, my existence as a contingent being, a being that is contingent on something else. I cannot exist, but for me to exist as a being that can not exist, there must be a being that is necessary that caused my existence. And if that being, whatever it or he is, caused my being, then it must have the power, the ability to cause my existence. The contingency, necessity, and act potency model are not arbitrary. Not arbitrary simply meaning that we're not just saying that out of nowhere, as we've already gone over in previous lessons in the past couple of weeks. These are logical necessities. These are things that when you work through these issues, they are inescapable, undeniable truths. So Geisler goes on then to say sometimes non-theists contend that theists have an arbitrary or a loaded way of speaking of the world that leans in favor of theism. So before we explain why that criticism is unfounded, let me ask you this. Is it entirely untrue? Do we sometimes speak in a way of speaking that leans in favor of theism?
Do you mean when we start talking, we put our biases into the description?
Essentially, yes. It is very difficult not to do that, isn't it?
Well,
Whatever your worldview is, you tend to speak in a way that leans in favor of your worldview. So I don't think the criticism is entirely unfounded, at least not in the sense that it's entirely untrue. I don't think it's particularly true of theists more than any other worldview, but I think it's normal and natural. Geisler writes, however, this criticism is clearly unfounded. I think what he means is it's unfounded in the sense that the only reason that our viewpoint seems to make sense is because we're speaking in a way that loads up the terms in favor of theism. Um, I don't think that's accurate, nor do I think it would be accurate to say that we're incapable of setting aside our bias and discussing things rationally. Um, he goes on to say reality must be viewed in terms of the possible, the impossible, and the necessary. There are no other possibilities. These are logically exhaustive ways to speak of reality, and it is far from arbitrary to speak of reality in logically exhaustive categories, especially since logic is applicable to reality. Okay? Logic is applicable to reality. Now, that is an earth shattering statement. Um, let's let's just see if we can determine if these are really the only logical ways of speaking of reality. Exhaustive means that there are no others, right? This is the exhaustive list. We've exhausted all possibilities. Is there anything in reality that is not either possible, impossible, or necessary? That is not one of those three things. Can you think of anything in reality that would not either be a possible thing, an impossible thing, or a necessary thing?
well, bacon fits under the necessary. So
Okay.
no, I can't.
In a sense, it is kind of almost counterintuitive to say that that in the realm of reality, one of the categories is the impossible, right? You could say nothing impossible is real, right? Um, but what we mean by that is anything that you could suggest as being real must either fall into the possible category, the impossible category, or the necessary. When we say, for example, that certain things are intrinsically impossible, non being cannot create being, for example, in reality, that is in the category of impossibility. Non being cannot create being. So yeah, I think we can clearly say that those are exhaustive. Um, he goes on to say that to speak of the world and God as either caused, self caused, or uncaused is also not arbitrary. Again, there are no logical possibilities, no other logical possibilities. So this is somewhat reviewy, right? We went over this before, but again, I think it's important. You're going to experience this criticism. Okay. When we say anything that exists is either caused, self caused, or uncaused, I would challenge anyone to give me another possibility, right? Just as we can say definitively anything in reality is either possible, impossible, or necessary, we can also say definitively if something exists, that means it either was caused by something else, caused by itself, or it was uncaused. And since being cannot create non being, self caused is impossible. And that's how we arrive at for everything there must be a cause, but somewhere there must be a first cause. Since the first cause cannot be self caused, and the first cause cannot be caused by something else, or it's not the first cause, then the first cause must be uncaused. That's not arbitrary. There are no other logical possibilities. So, for us to base a metaphysical view on what includes all the comprehensive possibilities about reality, and then to eliminate some as actually impossible, establish others as possible, and some of these as actual and contingent, and establish the remaining one as actual and necessary, is far from an arbitrary imposition of some so called loaded model on reality. Now, last week, Geisler mentioned a couple of times that we are accused of a four term fallacy in our reasoning. And since I know that you guys probably use the phrase four term fallacy on a regular basis in everyday conversation at the supermarket, we probably don't need to explain that. But just for my own benefit, because when it comes to these Greek and Latin origin arguments from logic, I sometimes need a refresher. Let me go over really quickly what a four term fallacy is. There are a series going back to the times of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans of what are called the logical fallacies. Um, my personal favorite logical fallacy is a fallacy. I won't bother with the Greek or Latin, but the English translation goes like this: after this, before this. Or excuse me, before this, after this, therefore, after this, caused by what's before. Okay. After this, therefore, because this is the simple version. After this, therefore, because this. For example, the rooster crowed, the sun came up. Therefore, the crowing of the rooster caused the sun to come up. How many of you would accept that as a logical argument? No. I'll give you an example from ripped from the headlines. How many of you got so sick of hearing the phrase October surprise beginning in September and going all the way through the month of October during the election, right? Um, the October surprise is one of the greatest myths in American politics. Um, the idea that something is going to be revealed about one of the candidates, and it's going to be so earth shattering that it's going to determine the outcome of the election. And all you have to do is release some news story 2 weeks before election day. And then if the outcome of the election is what you were predicting, then you can say, see, I told you, right? And then if it's not the outcome you were expecting, you say, well, I guess that October surprise wasn't really that big of a deal. Or maybe the October surprise is a myth, right? People don't really make up their minds in large numbers. People don't make up their minds based on some last minute, unvetted news story that they haven't had time to really process on who they're going to vote for. Um, after this, therefore, because this. That's a logical fallacy. Um, you know, uh, another example is when someone says, well, we had this vote at the ABA in this year concerning our missionaries. And as a result, over the next 10 years, we started to see more money come into the mission program than ever before. I'm just going to say this very, very gently. I would challenge you to find any 10-year period, any decade in the history of the American Baptist Association where the missions office did not get more money than every previous decade before for two reasons. One, inflation. Two, more missionaries require more fundraising, and our churches tend to respond to need. Okay. There's another interesting factor that affects our mission giving that a lot of people overlook. One is the economy. To quote famous former President William Jefferson Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. Sometimes when the economy gets better, people have more money, so churches have more money, so more money goes to missionaries. If you try to suggest that a specific vote on whatever topic it might be led to more money going to the missionaries, I would say prove it. Prove that that's the direct cause, because I doubt you can. That's just an example of logical fallacies. Okay, one from politics, one from the world of our churches. Now, let me tell you what a four-term fallacy is. How many of you remember studying algebra in school? Everybody loves algebra, right? Well,
Got it.
let me let me give you two sets of of algebraic expressions that are simple. A is greater than B. C is less than D. Okay, A is greater than B. C is less than D. Therefore, A is greater than D. Does that conclusion make sense? No, it does not, because I gave you four terms: A, B, C, D. I made a statement about A's relationship to B and C's relationship to D, but at no point did I connect A and D in any way, or B and C in any way. Therefore, it's a logical fallacy to say because A is greater than B and C is greater than D, therefore A is greater than D. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's a logical fallacy. That's what a four-term fallacy is. You use four terms, you say something about two of them and something about the other two, and then you try to use that to prove a connection between one of the first pair and one of the second pair. Four-term fallacy. They claim about us that when we say um, for every cause, for every effect, there must be a cause. Everything that exists must have been caused, but something must have been the first cause that caused all the other causes. In the falling domino, something must have been the first cause. They accuse us of using a four term fallacy, a four term argument. It's not true. They can't show us a four term argument or a four term fallacy, but that's what they accuse us of. The reason I mention that is because it's going to come up again later in the chapter. Okay. So, for us to base our metaphysical view, our philosophical worldview, our base first, our first philosophical understanding on what includes all the comprehensive possibilities about reality, to eliminate some as actually impossible and establish others as possible, and some of these as actual and contingent, and establish the remaining one as actually and necessary, is far from an arbitrary imposition of some so called loaded model on reality. So the logical fallacies are one of the examples of how they claim we have a loaded model on reality. Okay. Um, Second, the God of reason is the same as the God of revelation. So we have reasoned out from causality that God is the uncaused first cause of all existence in reality. And we have determined that the attributes that are deducible from logic that must of necessity undeniably be ascribed to the God of reason is identical to the God revealed in the Bible, that he has all the same attributes. Some opponents of theistic arguments claim the God of reason is not the real God of revelation. So if you believe in a God of reason, but you deny, excuse me 1 second, I must swap out an empty coffee cup for a full one, or I will begin blathering and you will not understand what I'm saying. All right. If you deny, for example, that the God of the Bible is the one true God, is real, but you believe in a God of reason, what are you left with? What worldview do you arrive at?
And you're left with a God of reason.
Yes, a God without revelation, but a God of reason.
And you have a God of your own imagination.
Yeah, that's true. Um, but the worldview that you would have is deism. You can reason that God exists from nature, but a deistic God who is transcendent beyond creation, but not immanent in creation. In other words, he wound the world up like a clock and set it in motion, but he doesn't bother to oil the gears, would not reveal himself to us in any way other than through nature and reason. Because to do so, he would have to intervene with revelation. He wouldn't speak to us as he does in the scriptures. Okay. The only voice of God we would know by the deist model is the echo of his voice in creation. So the God of reason without the God of revelation is deism. So the deistic opponents of theistic arguments claim the God of reason is not the real God of revelation, as the church father Tertullian famously asked, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? What has the God of Aristotle to do with the God of Abraham? However, this is a false disjunction between reason and revelation. It is a logical fallacy to say that the God that you can deduce from reason cannot also be the God who reveals himself to us. In fact, I would argue that it must be the same God. And let me tell you why. Approximately how long was it between Adam's creation in the garden, or more to the point, the expulsion from Eden? How long was it from the days that Adam and Eve walked out of the garden, approximately, until the writing of the book of Job and the writing of the Torah by Moses?
8 weeks.
So, yeah, in Old Testament survey, it was about 8 weeks. Um, the answer is somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 years, depending on if you accept um, the Masoretic descriptions of the Table of Nations in Genesis 10 and 11, and Genesis 5 and 6, the descent from Adam to Noah. Or if you accept something closer to the Septuagint version of those same chapters, or which manuscripts you're looking at. But no matter which manuscripts you're looking at, it's 2,500 to 3,500 years approximately, right? Okay, it's been about 3,500 years since Elihu and Moses gave us Job and Genesis. So my question is, for half of human history, approximately, or nearly half, there was no written revelation. There were only sporadic interactions between God and men, and very few people were present for those interactions. Does it make sense that God would have left us with no way of understanding that God was there? No. God left in our own ability to reason and in the natural world that He created. God left us with enough to reason out who He is. We can determine, based on what we see in nature, um, doesn't the Psalms tell us that? There is no speech nor language where their voice is not heard. The heavens declare the glory of God, right? The universe itself speaks to us of God. How does it do that? By its presence. How do we hear it? By deduction, by reason. God gave us the ability to know He is there by seeing what He made. So Tertullian is wrong when he says, what has the God of Aristotle to do with the God of Abraham? The answer is reason alone will only get us so far because we are fallen, because we are sinners. Reason alone will only get us so far. They will only get us so far, and then revelation is necessary. Okay. Those of you who are in my Old Testament survey class will know that I believe the most significant theological premise, the most significant theological truth in the book of Job is not about human suffering or the righteousness of God or angels and demons. It is the necessity of Scripture. Because five of the wisest men of their time sat around reasoning about God and came to some really stupid theology. But what they knew about God is actually astonishing when you consider the book predates the oldest written revelation of God. How much they knew about God is astounding. Their bad theology demonstrates the necessity of Scripture. Okay? Um, you might put it this way: their theism is startling, but their theology stunk. Um, so, like two mountain climbers approaching the same peak from different directions, reason and revelation are both approaching one and the same peak. Since both the God of reason and the God of the Christian revelation are infinite, all powerful, intelligent beings, and so on, they must be one and the same. For there cannot be two infinite beings of the very same kind. Because for there to be two beings, they must differ. And two infinite beings are the very same kind of being. Hence, there can be only one. There can be only one such infinite, eternal being. Regardless of how one comes to know about that being, by reason or by revelation, there can be only one. Secondly, the God of reason is religiously significant. Some critics have argued that the God of reason is not worthy of worship. No one is moved by an unknown mover. No one is caused to worship by concluding that there is an uncaused cause. Yeah, I'm not buying that. You know, we've been able to reason more about God than just that he is an uncaused cause, right? Um, he must be intelligent because he knew how to create the universe. He must be infinite because he had the power to create the universe. He must be all valuable and all good because he is infinite. He didn't have to create the world, but he created it anyway. That shows that he is beneficent or um, He he is a person who gives when he doesn't need to, right? He's he's benevolent. He's magnanimous, right? And if he's infinite, then he must be infinitely magnanimous. A being that is infinitely good, infinitely loving, infinitely magnanimous, and infinitely valuable is the very definition of worthy of worship. What else would you worship? This is what Geisler calls a false bifurcation. Bifurcation meaning you're trying to separate the uncaused cause from a God who is worthy of worship. But the God resulting from reason, such as in the cosmological argument given above, is absolutely perfect and good. And as the absolute good, he has absolute worth. And what has absolute worth is absolutely worthy. Get that? Is what has absolute worth is absolutely worthy of worship, which is what worship is, namely attributing absolute worth to something. Or, to put it another way, the God of reason shown above is the ultimate being, uncaused cause. And what is ultimate is worthy of an ultimate commitment, which is what Paul Tillich called a religious experience. Therefore, the God known Therefore, the God known via the above cosmological argument is a religiously worthy being. Okay? So the God of reason is also worthy of worship. Even if we don't knew nothing about him from special revelation in Scripture, he would be worthy of worship. The God of reason is existentially and morally relevant. It is interesting to me that there are those who would say, okay, you can reason out that God exists, but how is that relevant to me? You can show me logically, you can show me rationally, you can show me from the existence of creation, from existential reality itself, you can demonstrate to me, yes, there must be a God. But how does that affect my life? What am I supposed to do with that? If you don't have divine revelation to tell me what to do with that, how is that relevant? Okay. But I'm going to argue the same as Geisler. Once you acknowledge, once you acknowledge that the divine sovereign of the universe exists, then he is ultimately relevant to everything, to our lives, to our morality, to our aspirations, to our goals. If he is our maker, if he is our creator, then everything is relevant to him because everything is relative to him. If God does not exist, then neither do I. I'd say that's pretty relevant, wouldn't you? To me, saying that the existence of God is not relevant to my life would be like me saying to Junior that Senior is not relevant to his life, right? If there's a Junior, there's a Senior. Junior, would you say that Senior is relevant to your life?
I'll say 100%.
Yeah. Um, he also points out that God is also the here and now cause of our existence. Okay. He's not just the historical cause of our existence, he's the here and now cause of our existence. Colossians actually says the same thing, but I think this is also reasonable. It can be reasoned, it's reasonable, able to be reasoned, that we not only need a God of history, who created us in the beginning, we also need a God here and now to maintain our existence. We need a present cause. As Paul told the Athenians, in him we live and move and have our being. And that was not news to them. He was actually quoting Aristotle. Okay? The idea that the God of reason, the God of Aristotle, is also the God of Abraham, the God of Revelation, is exactly the point Paul was making to the Athenians in the book of Acts. If God is not here and now, causing us to continue to exist, what would happen? The answer is we would cease to exist.
Yeah, if he wasn't here to hold everything together,
Yeah.
it would come apart unless, well, he holds it together by his word, but yeah.
Yeah, so Simon Peter tells us that the earth will melt with a fervent heat. The elements will melt with a fervent heat. The very elemental particles of existence will come apart. Have we ever seen what happens when elements come apart? Ask the people of Hiroshima or Nagasaki what happens when elements come apart, right? When
Chernobyl.
the, yeah, Chernobyl. When, um, when the subatomic particles on the outward part of an atom, the electrons, um, begin to decay their orbits and come and bombard the nucleus where the neutrons and the protons are, what happens? You have an atomic explosion. And it only takes one atom to destroy a city and make it uninhabitable. Imagine what would happen if Jesus, by whom all things consist, by whom all things exist, by whom all things subsist, if Jesus simply let go of reality, what would happen to the elements? They would melt with a fervent heat. I don't think God has to do anything to cause the destruction of the current universe when he makes the new one, except let go of it. Take his hands off of it, and it's all gone. What could be more existentially relevant than that? Further, since he is absolutely good, this God is relevant to the way we live. Because if an absolutely good God exists, then it makes an ultimate difference in how we live. Such an ultimately good being is the ultimate answer to the question, so what? So, what one does about this ultimate being will make an ultimate difference in both the quality and meaning of one's life here and hereafter eternally. If God is all good and God is all moral, then isn't it reasonable to deduce, to conclude that God must be all just? And if God is all just, then doesn't it follow that there must be ultimate justice in God's universe? And if there is ultimate justice, don't you think we should live in such a way that anticipates justice for our actions and activities, for our attitudes? I mean, if dad isn't coming home, do you bother cleaning your room?
Right.
But if you know he is coming home,
Amen.
Junior.
Yeah, brother, it's funny that I want God to be just and merciful to me and my mistakes, but I want him to punish the one that punish others for their mistakes. Oh, they're going to pay for it. Oh, they think they're getting away. They're going to pay for it. So yeah,
So yeah, I mean, David struggled with that. Read the Psalms, right? I want God to be merciful to me and just to you, right? I want God to be merciful to me and just to you. By the way, mercy and justice are not mutually exclusive. I'm only kidding about that. But why are mercy and justice not mutually exclusive? Can anyone tell me? Calvary. That's the answer. Calvary. Mercy and justice are not mutually exclusive because Jesus already died for my sins. Okay. All right. Summary and conclusion on theism. We conclude then that theism is the only adequate worldview for two reasons. One, because, wait, can y'all hear me? Okay. I just heard something in my ear that made me think my Bluetooth might have shut off. Um, all other worldviews are self defeating or actually unaffirmable. Okay. We went through 6 other worldviews and we concluded each one violated the metaphysical laws of existence, the first principles of existence. Okay, the undeniable truths of reality. And therefore, by process of elimination, we were left with theism. But then we went and we took it a step further and we demonstrated that the laws of existence, the first principles of reality, the metaphysical principles, actually lead us to the conclusion that God exists. So this recognition leads inescapably to the existence of an infinitely perfect and an all-powerful personal being beyond this world who always has been and is currently the sustaining cause of all finite, changing, and contingent beings. Neither do those other worldviews, as theism does, provide an existentially relevant God. In short, they fail to live up to the standards for a world view. I want to read that again. Okay. Neither do those other worldviews, as theism does, provide an existentially relevant God. In short, they fail to live up to the standards for a worldview. Because they can't give you something that is relevant. They can't give you something that is all encompassing, which is what a worldview is, right? The view of everything. So all the major criticisms of theism have been answered in this and the previous chapter. Indeed, most of these criticisms miss the significance of this argument based on existential causality and are directed toward invalid a priori from before arguments. Okay? They direct their arguments against arguments for theism that we shouldn't be wasting our time or our breath on, such as the ontological argument. Okay? The ontological argument is this goofy idea that I can conceive of the ultimate being, and therefore there is the potential that an ultimate being could exist. But could he be the ultimate being if he does not exist? Well, no, then he's not the ultimate being. But an ultimate being must exist, therefore the ultimate being must exist. It's convoluted double talk that doesn't mean anything. If I were an atheist, I would attack that stupid argument too. I'm a theist and I don't buy the argument. Okay? I try to stay away from arguments that I know that I know are non-convincing, right? If it doesn't convince me, I don't expect it to convince somebody who doesn't agree with me already. Or they base their arguments, they aim their arguments toward insufficient a posteriori arguments from after arguments, such as on an unrational or a rationally unjustifiable form of the principle of sufficient reason. Okay. In this sense, neither a priori nor a posteriori proofs for God's existence are rationally inescapable. Um, we talked about that when we were doing the methodologies, when we talked about rationalism. This does not mean that there is no argument that combines both the a priori self-evident principle of existential causality and the undeniable a posteriori fact that something exists. Okay? So you put those two things together. I exist, and everything that exists has a cause, existential causality, plus I exist, okay? And you get there must be a first cause. The criticisms of this argument for God's existence are unfounded. Thus, theism has found a firm ground in existence for the conclusion that God exists. In short, easily summed up in 5 words, this is a theistic universe. The theistic worldview is true, and all opposing worldviews are not true. Okay, so let me bring up the apologetics um, PowerPoint to your screens for our final moments together. All right. So, 7 basic worldviews, how we see ourselves, the world, reality, and God. That's what we've been discussing. We found that deism argues for a God who is transcendent beyond the world, but not active in the world. We found that finite Godism says that God is not infinite, but he does have limitations. And usually that expresses itself in modern times in a God who has ultimate potentiality, but not infinite actuality. God infinitely can be, but God is not infinitely yet real. He is growing, he is changing. We are adding to God. Okay. Pantheism. God is the universe. Panentheism. God is in the universe. As the mind to the body, so God to the universe. Polytheism. The difference between polytheism and finite godism is that finite godism believes in one finite God, polytheism believes in many finite gods. Atheism. Atheism simply says there is no God, there are no gods, the God of reason does not exist, the God of revelation does not exist, the gods of the pagans do not exist. Theism, there is one true, infinite God. 7 basic ways the world can be viewed. 7 basic ways reality can be viewed. 7 basic ways God can be viewed, and 7 different ways of viewing myself. Okay. We looked at each of these in terms of these first principles of existence, the principles of being, the laws of being, and we found 6 of them to be lacking. All right. So deism, deism suggests that God created everything and then somehow went away. However, deism claims to believe in an infinite God who is transcendent but not immanent. He is above but not within the universe. But let me ask you a question about that with respect to the fourth principle of being, the principle of the excluded middle, either being or non being. Doesn't God have to be either infinite or finite?
Yes.
Okay. How can an infinite being be absent? How can an infinite being be elsewhere? How can an infinite being be transcendent beyond the universe, but not immanent in it? That is, in and of itself, finite, right? If you can be elsewhere, but not here, you are not infinite. So
I
deism fails the fourth principle of being, the law of the excluded middle, either being or non being.
that isn't. Yes, God is infinite, but can't He still choose not to be present somewhere, like hell?
So you raise a good question as it relates to hell. Let me answer your question generally first and then apply the answer to hell specifically.
Okay.
Um, can God choose to be absent from somewhere? The answer is no. God is omnipresent. He is infinite. We've already covered in class, God cannot do what is intrinsically impossible. Anything that is possible to do, God can do. But there are certain things that are not possible for God because of his nature. One of those is he cannot be less than infinite. He cannot be less than eternal. He cannot be less than omnipresent. He is everywhere. So applying that answer to hell, this is one of the most sad things about hell and eventually the lake of fire. While we can escape the lake of fire, God will always God will always be infinite. God will always be omnipresent. He will always be with the damned in their damnation. He will always feel their suffering. He will always know their pain. So God in his justice must condemn the impenitent sinner to eternal torment. But in doing so, he is also he is also sentencing himself to eternal torment. But for God, it's even worse because God has always been not only infinite in space, but infinite in time. Not only omnipresent in space, but omnipresent in time, which means from eternity past, God has essentially already been experiencing all the pain and suffering of every sinner in hell and the lake of fire.
So then, if I'm understanding, so God, since He is omnipresent, He cannot withdraw Himself from anywhere.
Right.
However, that does not necessarily mean He's revealing Himself everywhere.
Yes. So,
I don't know
sorry, go ahead.
how I was that you that it, that was, and since it was designed for Satan and his angels, that's kind of an area that is void of him. Um, it, but I guess that's another subject.
Yeah, and you're definitely not alone in forming that conclusion. I simply find that that conclusion isn't tenable for me.
Okay.
Um, Finite Godism. We looked at finite Godism and we examined the idea in much the same way that we have the same problem with deism. Finite Godism suggests that God is changing, that God is growing, that God is still becoming his ultimate self. That God is ultimate in his potentiality, but not ultimate in his actuality. Okay. Um, I find this to be difficult because of the simple fact that uh, the second law, the second principle of metaphysics, the second law of metaphysics is the principle of identity. Being is being. God is either infinite or he is not. Okay. An infinite being has to be both infinite potential. Excuse me. An infinite being has to be infinite actual. God has no potentiality. There is nothing God can be. There is only God is. In pantheism, we hear that God is the universe is God. This then makes the universe itself eternal. And so God becomes the self cause of the universe in pantheism, except, except non being cannot produce being. That's the principle of causality, number 5. Something must exist in order to cause something else to exist. Something must exist in order to cause even itself to exist. So the principle of pantheism that says the universe, God the universe, is its own self cause eternally violates the simple principle that non being cannot produce being. Okay? There's no such thing as self caused. The pantheist, the panentheist says that as the body is to the uh, mind, so the universe is to God. The God and the universe share being, but are not one and the same. Okay? God is the mind of the universe. The universe is the body of God. I find that interesting um, because it suggests, once again, that the universe is eternal. The universe has always existed, and that God has always existed as its mind or its sentience. The sentient universe principle, however, gives me the impression that there is no causality. Non being cannot produce being. That's the principle of causality. But if the universe has always existed, then nothing caused it to exist. And so, once again, I think the fifth principle of causality flies in the face of the concept of panentheism. I don't think pantheism and panentheism are different enough from each other for the panentheist to overcome the fallacy of pantheism. They have the same problem. Okay, um, they have the same problem. The universe then becomes self-caused. So the polytheist says that multiple gods exist. But in order to have multiple gods, the polytheist has to make those gods finite. The reason those gods have to be finite is because you can't have two infinite beings. So Zeus and Apollo cannot be infinite and be distinct from each other. But when you say that the gods themselves are finite, then you run into this problem that if the gods are finite, where did the gods come from? Because anything that is finite must have a cause. It's the very definition of contingency. And lastly, we looked at atheism before we got to theism. And when we looked at atheism, we came to an inescapable problem. Principle number 5, the fifth law of being, non-being cannot produce being. The principle of causality. And principle number 3, the principle of non-contradiction. Being is not non-being. Something exists because I exist. Okay? Being is being. Because I exist, existence is real. Being is not non-being. I cannot exist and not exist at the same time. Being or non-being. I can't both be in a state of existence and be in a state of non-existence at the same time in the same way. Non-being cannot produce being. Therefore, something caused my existence, and whatever caused my existence must have existed before me in order to cause my existence. Okay? Being causes being similar to itself. Whatever caused my existence, according to the principle of analogy, self-evident, undeniable truth, whatever caused my existence, I must share certain characteristics with. Not all of its characteristics, but I must share some of its characteristics. Okay? But if something that is in some way similar to myself caused my existence, but non-being cannot produce being, then something similar to myself must have pre-existed me that caused my existence. But ultimately, whatever caused my existence either must have a cause or must be uncaused. And somewhere back in history, there must have been an uncaused first cause of all other causes. Thus, the uncaused first cause is God. In simple terms, that's the cosmological argument for God. It's in many ways Aristotelian. It's based on the philosophy, the philosophical tenets of Aristotle, but it's far older than that. It's older than Abraham. It predates the flood. This is basic, inescapable, non-deniable rational, logical principles, and those principles lead us to God. All right. Any questions on uh, how we get to theism from the metaphysical first principles?
I can definitely see why it's so easy to put your biases into that. But even kind of as you were talking, I kept, my brain kept kind of kicking in the idea that it, not the conclusions were faulty, but that um, it kind of goes back to one definition of terms. Um, anyway, it's very easy to force the direction that way. Um, so
Yeah, you have to be very careful when you're making the arguments that you are aware of the fact that someone with a different worldview can challenge you, right? Um, and as you're talking to them, what I find is they keep bringing they keep bringing themselves back to the fallacies, right? Let them make their arguments, and as they make their arguments, bring them back to the logical fallacies. Um, I mean, the pantheist may actually deny the first principle of existence, which to me is the ultimate undeniable truth, right? Pantheist says nothing exists. Existence is itself an illusion. So tomorrow we're going to look at postmodernism, and next Monday we will review everything that we've gone over in this semester. And then on Tuesday of next week, we will take the final exam. And to reiterate what I said at the beginning of class, the only resources that you can have on your desk while taking the exam are your Bible, your notebook with your personal notes from this class, and the writing assignments that you have written from this class. So essays, research paper, writing assignments from this class, and your notebook and your Bible. Those three things. Um, I would say with those three things and an hour roughly in 20 minutes to take your test, everyone should get an A. All right. Thank you very much, guys. I will see some of you later today, and I'll see all of you tomorrow.
thank you much.
Amen, brother.